Josef Šimánek was a Czech writer and dramatist. Born in 1883 in Jindřichův Hradec into the family of an insurance official, he studied at the gymnasium at Jindřichův Hradec before moving on to study at the Karl Ferdinand University in Prague. He studied world literature and modern philology and in 1909 received his doctorate in philosophy. Following his graduation, he worked in the Bohemian Union for promoting foreign visits to Bohemia, then from 1918 as secretary to the Czech Commission for Youth, and between 1924 and 1949 he was the librarian of the Ministry of Agriculture as well as of the Land Registry, while also serving as the General Secretary of the Scouts Union. Between 1909 and 1914, he served as editor on a variety of literary magazines, including New Horizon, Library of Western Literature, and Progressive Review, among others. He was a noted occultist, having joined several secret societies, such as the Universalia Hermetic Society. After 1924, he also joined the Simeon Martinist Lodge, but after 1925, he left, along with a group of others, to found the new Gedeon Martinist Lodge. He died in Prague in 1959. He began publishing poetry and drama, his first prose appearing in 1909. We shall examine two of his short novels and two of his short story collections, all concerning ancient Greece. Firstly, The Grove of the Satyrs was published in 1915. Similarly to his later works, we have a young archaeologist, here named Harry Stackton, as the protagonist. The story concerns his discovery of a cave used by the ancient Greeks and by Pythias to deliver prophecy, along with a special emerald used in ceremony that has magical properties. At the same time, he also comes across a grove which is shunned by the local inhabitants because it is said to be haunted by wild satyrs. Stackton confides this in his friend Howard, who manages to use the emerald to bring Stackton into a trance to communicate with celestial beings in order to unravel an ancient prophecy which proclaims Stackton as the man who will defy the will of Artemis and fall in love with the nymph Chrysis. He manages to be wedded to the nymph, but her rival, Alice Burton, who is known to be somewhat of a witch, foils his plans by stealing the enchanted emerald and orchestrates Stockton's death, because she will have him at least in death, or so she claims, leaving his body bruised and mangled after being trampled to death by wild satyrs. The biggest flaw in the story is the very obvious inspiration by Arthur Machen, which doesn't seem like a bad idea on paper, but Šimánek's language in the book is very rigid, almost slavishly imitating Machen's words at points, not realizing that Machen's phrasing works better in English, and that his words as a result, when directly translated into Czech, feel very artificial as a result. Still, it is not a bad book, though it is a trifle too reliant on descriptive passages. The Music of Acheron, an unhistorical tale of old Greece, was first published in 1919. The story begins with the narrator suddenly being confronted with a ghost who tells him the story the narrator later admits isn't exactly historically accurate. The story proper possibly takes place on Attica. The protagonist is one Nikokreon, a graduate of the sportsman's school led by Kleandros, a local sportsman and philosopher. Nikokreon and Kleandros are invited to an opulent feast at the beginning of the book, held at the villa of Parnesios. Here they see a group of females, emboldened to take part in the feast, despite local custom, by the example of the poetess Byblis, lover of the deceased poet Hegesion. The present company also includes the artist Aristogaton, whose infatuation with one of the dancers angers his lover Clio, who proceeds to kill herself the following day, Aristogaton only mourning the fact he couldn't finish his picture in time for which he was the model. Meanwhile, Nicocreon, who is madly in love with Byblis, decides on his course of action. Byblis, a female poet deeply inspired by Sappho, is cold to every man's attempt to excite her passion, being loyal to Hegestion beyond the grave, claiming he was the only man of the type that could ever interest her. Nicocreon decides to try and alter his mannerisms and appearance to be an exact duplicate of Hegestion, to make Byblis fall in love with him before returning to his original self. He memorizes the elusive poems that the dead Hegestion had intentionally suppressed from the public, not deeming it worthy of their genius, and goes on to the man's island estates to be surrounded by his creations in order to soak up more of the man's creative essence. However, while on the island, as he becomes acquainted with Hegestion's old neighbours, he finds out that he begins to even physically resemble Hegestion. Also, at times he seems to have sudden blackouts, and finds out afterwards that he had acted in ways exactly identical to the actions of Hegestion. He doesn't seem to be able to fight these blackouts off, no matter how hard he tries. Leaving the island and desiring to throw off the shade of Hegestion as soon as possible, he visits Byblis, but blacks out, and when he comes to, he finds her murdered by his own hand, yet strangely contented. Whether or not it was possibly the shade of Hegestion controlling him in order to kill her, so that the two may be together in the afterlife, the book never even posits. That is just my interpretation. The story begins rather interestingly given the sudden possession angle and the unexpected ending, but the problem is that, though the book is less than 100 pages, that development comes more than halfway into the book. The story until that point had been mostly static, due to the novella's chief problem being Šimánek's obsessive over-descriptiveness. Most of the text is spent on describing how all the characters are dressed, what ornaments the women have in their hair, what shape the pillars are in people's dining halls, how the instruments being played look like, what wines are being poured out, what flowers are in vases on the table and what those vases look like, etc., etc., to the point where the sudden appearance of plot seems quite unexpected, and the ending seems kind of rushed as a result. One would expect at least something more out of the meeting of Nicocreon and Byblis, perhaps a story about the shade of Hegestion dominating Nicocreon's body and his attempts to regain control. But as it stands, the story just kind of ends the moment it gets going. This is by far the weakest of Šimánek's works I have read, and the worst example of his pacing to date. The following book, Battle of Shadows, was published in 1920. The title novella, taking up most of the book, is quite unusual for Šimánek. While it is, as is most often the case, related to Old Greece, a significant part of the story takes place in the Middle Ages. The story deals with a man named Odon, the narrator, visiting his friend Helga, along with a group of a few other friends, at his house on the site of an old monastery. At the end of their get-together, the narrator is pulled aside by Helga and led through a secret tunnel underground to see the statue of a woman crowned with the crescent moon. The statue is beautiful, but the sight of it excites evil passions and causes people to commit vile acts. One of Odon's friends, more mysteriously, is seeing a girl at that time who is an exact duplicate of the statue. Following their return, Helga lends Odon a manuscript penned by a medieval monk who was present during the last days of the monastery. The statue, taken to be a statue of Venus Astarte, was donated to the monastery by Don Tancred, the monastery's old benefactor. The statue soon exerts a baleful influence on the brothers, especially on Brother Rufus. Though it gets purified with holy water and gets used as an image of the Madonna, Brother Rufus is still moved by it to leave the monastery and follow a woman who is an exact duplicate of the statue. He is pursued to a ruined castle in order to be forced to return by an armed group of free brothers, but only one returns alive. Soon after, the brothers in the monastery begin to fall to vile temptations, and then one night Don Tancred comes to the monastery accompanied by a gang of vile associates and holds a blasphemous ritual in honor of the statue. Upon witnessing this, the narrating monk runs off in fear and runs into the only other uncorrupted monk, who went crazy and cut off his own penis in order to become a saint, declaring his desire to do the same to the narrator. Eventually he falls unconscious and is nursed back to health by Don Tancred himself, finishing his manuscript as he sees the monastery go up in flames. In the present, Helgar tells Odon that the statue was created in ancient Greece by the sculptor Aristippos, a friend of Plato, as the personification of the beauty of evil in support of the sculptor's philosophical theories. But the statue of Artemis Urania takes on an evil life and forces the sculptor to become the head priest of an evil, blasphemous cult whose corrupting influence is spread constantly. Aristippos spends decades in its service until he is almost 100 years of age, when he is visited by the shade of Plato. Plato warns him he will have to live through many incarnations, always succumbing to and serving the statue until he finds a way to defeat it. It is revealed Helgar is the latest of these reincarnations, who are always being dogged by the earthly incarnation of the statue, and that among the other incarnations of Aristippos were Don Tancred and Lord Byron. Finally, Helgar completes the exact opposite of the Artemis Urania statue in order to counterbalance its evil influence, but the current incarnation of the statue's baleful spirit sets off to destroy it, not realizing that it will also destroy the statue of Artemis Urania. Battle of Shadows is a very enthralling story, with the medieval setting being a welcome departure from the otherwise ubiquitous Old Greek motif in Šimánek's work. The following story, the Cyrenaean Amphora, is a nice variation on the vampire motif, having a beautiful woman inhabiting an ancient Greek vase, slowly draining the life force out of the narrator until it's destroyed by accident by his fiancée. In The Curse of Beauty, we find Phaedonos at a marriage feast where he finds his friend Archias fatally stabbed in the garden. His former fiancée had stabbed him to death because he had rejected her in favor of a naiad whom he had found inhabiting a fantastical spring fashioned by a forgotten genius, but who disappeared forever on the morning following their coupling, as per the decree of the gods. The sacrifice has an artist begging a local doctor to save his ailing lover using the Persian magic the doctor had learned from his mother. But in order to save her, the doctor sacrifices the masterful work of art the artist had created and is then murdered by the artist as a result. The gift of Aigipan has a very cold maiden named Atalanta, suddenly seduced by the shepherd Ascalios, who, however, realizes he was only a tool for Pan once the girl gives birth to a child with horns, but he doesn't seem to mind very much. The Flour of Forgiveness is the tale of a witch who ensnares the heart of a man and has his wife murdered, but trying to make him forget about the wife whose death he bemoans constantly results in him forgetting about the witch completely instead and chasing her out of his house. The collection is certainly varied, and the shorter stories are well developed, and have a good weird atmosphere without demonizing ancient Greece, something Šimánek never did, unlike other writers. The final book for today, Gods on Earth, Myths and Novels, was published in 1925. I will only be talking about the more extensive stories, as there are some quite short ones that are mere vignettes. The Lost Tune The longest and a quasi-novella has the narrator, a young archaeologist and admirer of ancient Greece, set out to find the mythical lost lyre of Orpheus on the island of Lesbos. He manages to discover it in an old cave, and at the same time, he finds a mystical company in a concealed temple and is crowned the king of Eleusina, from whose lineage he is secretly descended. He then meets the daughter of a professor archaeologist who helps him compile a treatise on the old Eleusian mysteries, while both fall in love. But at the end she leaves, for no stated reason, and he is left alone to await a future where they can possibly reunite. The initiated is similar to the gift of Aegipan, with the cold Hera being wooed by Aristaios, but refusing him due to having previously coupled with Dionysus during last year's Bacchantic celebrations, until the god appears to her and makes her see him in everything, even in Aristaios, whose bride she becomes. The asphodel wreath relates the story of two archaeologists who bitterly hate each other, and who both fall in love with an ancient image of a beautiful girl uncovered during the archaeological dig, using a special flower that grows only on the island. The narrator manages to get into a trance where he meets the girl in person, discovers that in a past life they were to be married, but that she was killed by her rejected suitor, and then find the rejected suitor, the man's rival archaeologist, trying to kill her again. But she takes out her pin and manages to kill him instead, so that when the narrator wakes up, he finds that his rival archaeologist had been mysteriously murdered in his sleep. Echo is the tale of a hunter related by a 200-year-old man. The hunter, who did not care for women at all, suddenly fell in love with the goddess Echo, whom he could never approach, and spent his whole life in quest of. The Slumbering Heart is the story of Philonide, who falls in love with a man who prefers another, and goes to a witch to help her forget her love, but has to return to her to get her pain back, as without it, she was nothing but a pale shadow completely removed from the rest of humanity. This collection is also good, but the stories here aren't as good or as detailed as the one in the previous. Of all of Šimánek's works I have read, I find Battle of Shadows to be the best, both as a collection and as the novella. Sadly, his works are hard to come by even in Czech, and have never been translated into a foreign language as far as I know.